The year 1886 had wrung dry laurel out and left it to bake in the sun. The sky was a sheet of faded blue tin, relentless and empty. For months, it had offered no apology, no mercy, only a heat that shimmered off the cracked earth in waves you could see, like ghosts of the water that was no longer there. The land itself was thirsty. It had split open in 1,000 places, a web of fissures that made the ground look like the shed skin of a colossal snake. The mesquite trees were brittle skeletons, their leaves long since turned to dust. The very wind was dry. It didn't cool, it only scoured, carrying grit that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. The heart of the town, and its deepest wound, was the well. Its stone lip was worn smooth by generations of hands and ropes, but now it was a monument to a forgotten abundance. The main bucket came up with more mud than water, and the town's communal supply had dwindled to a memory. For the ranchers ringing the small cluster of buildings, it was a death sentence whispered on that hot wind. Their cattle, hides stretched tight over ribs, milled near empty troughs with low, mournful bellows that sounded more like prayers than complaints. Their tongues, thick and dark, lolled from their mouths. They were dying on their feet, and every man who owned them knew the feeling. Eli Warren felt it in his bones. He stood over his own private well, a thing he had dug with his own 2 hands years ago, a source he had once believed was as reliable as sunrise. Now, it was failing. His shoulders, broad and corded from a life of labor, strained against the pull of the rope. The wooden crank handle of the windlass groaned with each turn, a dry, protesting squeal that echoed the ache in his joints. The rope, frayed and stiff with alkali dust, scraped against his palms. His hands were a testament to the drought. The skin was calloused thick as boot leather, but the dryness had split the calluses open. Fresh cracks crisscrossed old scars, small canyons of raw flesh that seeped blood onto the rough hemp. He didn't flinch. Pain was just another part of the weather. Finally, the bucket cleared the well's opening, heavy and sloshing. He guided it to rest on the wooden platform, his movements economical, stripped of any wasted energy. It was the last full bucket he'd get today, maybe the last for a long while. The water inside was murky, tinged with the taste of earth, but it was life. He looked toward his small herd, their shapes wavering in the heat. Not enough. It was never enough anymore. He straightened up, his back popping, and his gaze swept over his land. The dust devils danced across the barren fields where grass should have been. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were sunk deep in their sockets, shadowed by exhaustion and a solitude so profound it had become a part of his physical being, like the set of his jaw or the stoop in his shoulders. Life in Dry Laurel had changed when the railroad came through. The sharp, lonely blast of the train's whistle had replaced the church bell as the sound that marked the passing of the day. It brought mail and supplies, but it had also brought a new kind of power. The railroad had sunk its own deep well, powered by a steam engine that chuffed and sighed day and night. It had found the deep aquifer, the motherlode of water that the settlers' hand-dug wells could no longer reach. And with that water came a man, Cole Kincaid. Kincaid was the station master, but his true title was keeper of the pump. He controlled the flow. He had installed a massive holding tank and a single spigot, locked with a heavy brass padlock, from which he sold the water by the barrel. He was a man who smiled often, a thin, polished smile that never touched his cold eyes. He dressed in clean town clothes that seemed to repel the dust clinging to everyone else. He had become the most powerful man in the county without ever raising his voice or firing a gun. He simply owned the tap. That evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, leaving streaks of angry orange and purple, Eli rode into town. He tied his horse, a lean gelding named Flint, to the hitching post outside the saloon, the only establishment that seemed to defy the drought's oppressive gloom. Yellow light spilled from its swinging doors, carrying the tinny sound of a piano and the low murmur of men's voices. Eli didn't come for the company or the whiskey. He came because the general store was part of the same building, a small annex where a man could get the necessities. He needed salt for his cattle and a box of cartridges for his rifle. Coyotes were getting bolder. He pushed through the doors, keeping his head down, his hat brim pulled low. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat, stale beer, and sawdust. A haze of smoke hung in the lamplight. His presence caused a brief lull in the chatter. Men looked up from their cards, their eyes lingering on his tall, weathered frame. He ignored them. Solitude was his armor, a shield he had worn for so long he'd forgotten how to take it off. On a small, rickety stage at the far end of the room, a woman was singing. Her name was Nora Vale. Her voice was not pretty in the way of church choir sopranos. It was husky, laced with a smoky texture that seemed to carry the same dust and weariness as the land itself. It was a voice that had lived. She sang a mournful ballad about a lost love, but her eyes were not lost. They were sharp, intelligent, and constantly moving, scanning the room as if taking inventory. They were the eyes of a hunter, assessing every shadow, every face. She wore a simple dress of dark calico, its hemline gray with dust. There were rumors about her. They said she wasn't just a singer. They said she had come with the railroad surveyors, that she had a knack for reading the land. The most persistent rumor, the one whispered over warm beer and desperate hands of poker, was that Nora Vale knew things. She knew where to find water, a hidden vein deep beneath the bedrock that the railroad had missed, or perhaps chosen to ignore. Eli paid the rumors no mind. He moved to the small counter at the side, waiting for the proprietor to finish a transaction. He could feel the eyes on him, but he focused on the worn planks of the floor. "Warren." A smooth voice cut through the noise. Eli looked up. Cole Kincaid stood a few feet away, holding a cigar between two clean fingers. He took a deliberate puff, letting the smoke curl from his lips before he spoke again. "Heard your well's running low, like everyone else's." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of his own position. Eli simply nodded. Kincaid smiled that thin smile. "The railroad is a generous institution. We provide a service, but services must be paid for. I'm just reminding folks. The fee for the water goes up next week, and accounts must be kept current." He paused, looking around the room, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces of the other ranchers. "A man can't draw water on credit, and a man who can't water his stock soon finds he has no stock, and no land." The threat hung in the smoky air, unspoken but perfectly clear. Several farms on the edge of the territory already had for sale signs nailed to their fences, the wood warped, the paint peeling. Kincaid was collecting deeds as surely as he collected water fees. Eli finished his business, trading a small pouch of coins for a block of salt and a heavy box of shells. He tucked them into his saddlebags without a word to Kincaid and turned to leave. He wanted nothing more than the familiar silence of his own porch, the company of the stars. As he walked toward the door, he felt a gaze on his back that was different from the others. It wasn't pitying, or challenging, or fearful. It was analytical. He glanced toward the stage. The song had ended. Nora Vale was standing there, holding a glass of water, watching him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes followed his every step. As he pushed through the swinging doors and disappeared into the night, she saw what no one else bothered to notice. She didn't see a failed rancher or a surly recluse. She saw a back that, even in defeat, refused to slump. It was as straight and unyielding as a fence post set deep in the earth, braced to stand against a storm. Outside, the world was a study in shades of darkness. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. The hot wind picked up, a sudden gust that whipped dust from the street into a stinging cloud. It swirled around Eli's boots and slapped against the false fronts of the buildings. From down the street, the town's church bell began to toll the hour, but the dry air and the force of the wind seemed to steal its voice. The sound was flat, hoarse, a choked clang that died almost as soon as it was born. Eli was untying Flint's reins when the saloon doors swung open again. He didn't turn. He expected it to be one of Kincaid's men, or perhaps another rancher looking for a fight he couldn't win. "Mr. Warren." The voice was the one from the stage, husky, quiet, but carrying clearly over the wind. He slowly turned his head. Nora Vale stood on the saloon's covered porch, a dark silhouette against the yellow light spilling from behind her. Her arms were wrapped around herself, not from cold, but as if holding a thought in place. He waited, saying nothing. She took a step forward, moving out of the light and into the shadows with him. The wind pressed her dusty skirt against her legs and whipped a loose strand of dark hair across her face. She brushed it away, her eyes never leaving his. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk about water and about the man who guards it." The wind was a physical presence on the porch, a third party to their conversation. It pushed and pulled at them, trying to pry them apart or shove them back inside. It snagged the loose thread on Eli's cuff and made the brim of his hat tremble. He stood his ground, a rock against a persistent tide, and watched the woman. He had learned long ago that words were cheap currency, easily spent and often counterfeit. He trusted the strain of a rope, the heft of an axe, the smell of rain on the air. He did not trust talk. "The man who guards the water is Cole Kincaid," Eli said, his voice flat, scraped raw by the same dust that coated everything. "There's nothing to talk about. He has it. We don't—" "That's not the whole truth," Nora Vale replied, her voice pitched just loud enough to cut through the moan of the wind. She unbuttoned a small pocket hidden in the folds of her skirt and drew something out. It was a piece of buckskin, folded into a small square. As she worked it open, her hand trembled, a slight, betraying tremor that could have been from the wind or from fear. Eli watched the motion, his eyes missing nothing. She held the buckskin flat on her palm, a fragile offering against the aggressive night. In the faint light spilling from the saloon, he could see the drawing on it. It was a map, crude and hand-drawn in charcoal. The lines were simple, depicting the twin peaks of the San Isidro Mountains to the north and the crooked line of the rail spur to the south. In the valley between, a single spot was marked with a smudge of white chalk, circled 3 times. Beside it were 2 words, carefully lettered, "Widow's Back." Eli looked from the map to her face. Her eyes were fixed on his, waiting. He had heard the name before. It was a low, wind-swept hill a few miles out of town, a place of bad soil and twisted junipers, named for an old homesteader's wife who was said to have watched from its crest for a husband who never returned from the war. It was considered useless land. His voice was cold iron. "A map gets me water." The question was a dismissal, a wall he put up between her and the raw, aching hope he refused to acknowledge. He had seen maps before, maps to gold mines and lost silver that led men to ruin and sun-bleached bones. This felt no different. Nora did not flinch from his tone. She curled her fingers slightly, protecting the chalk marking from the wind. "No," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Trust gets you water." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the saloon sign swinging on its iron hooks. He was a man who had put his trust in the land, and the land had betrayed him. He had put his trust in the sky, and the sky had forgotten how to weep. Trust was a fool's game, a luxury for men with full barrels and fat cattle. Before he could voice his rejection, the swinging doors of the saloon pushed open, bathing the porch in a brighter wave of yellow light and noise. Cole Kincaid stood framed in the doorway, a fresh cigar in his hand, his vest perfectly buttoned. He surveyed the 2 of them, the wind not daring to touch his slicked-back hair. His thin smile widened. "An interesting pairing," Kincaid said, his voice smooth as polished river stone. He took a step onto the porch, his polished boots making no sound on the dusty boards. "Miss Vale, I do hope Mr. Warren isn't bothering you with his troubles. Some men don't know how to accept the march of progress." Nora folded the map with a swift, discreet movement, tucking it back into her hidden pocket. "We were just discussing the weather. Mr. Kincaid." "Ah, the weather." Kincaid chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Always the topic of conversation in Dry Laurel. Well, I have a forecast for you." He paused, letting his words gather weight. "The tap will be closing early tonight. Maintenance, and due to the increased demand and the strain on our equipment, the price per barrel will be going up tomorrow morning. Substantially." He looked directly at Eli, his eyes glinting. The message was clear. The threat was not just for tomorrow, but for this very moment. It was a warning. "I see you. I know you're desperate, and your desperation belongs to me." Kincaid tipped his hat. "Enjoy the evening breeze." He turned and went back inside, letting the doors swing shut, cutting off the light and leaving them in the deeper darkness once more. The air felt colder now, the threat having solidified into something tangible. They were no longer just two people talking. They were conspirators. Nora moved closer, so close that Eli could feel the faint warmth of her body and smell the scent of lavender and dust that clung to her. She spoke in a whisper, a current of intensity that made the hairs on his arms stand up. "He knows people are at their breaking point," she murmured, her eyes still on the doors as if she could see through the wood. Then she turned her full attention back to him, her gaze so direct it was like a physical touch. "We don't have until tomorrow." Her voice dropped even lower, becoming a secret meant only for him, for the wind to carry away. "Meet me by dawn. You will be able to read my body without a single word." The words hung in the air between them, strange and charged with a meaning he couldn't grasp. From inside the saloon, a burst of coarse laughter erupted from a table of card players near the door who had evidently overheard her. One of them made a crude comment, twisting her phrase into a vulgar invitation. Their minds, soaked in cheap whiskey and desperation, could only interpret her words in the most literal, base way. Eli felt the heat of their misjudgment, but showed no reaction. He did not blush or scowl. His face remained a stony mask. He was a man who understood the mechanics of a pump, the temperament of a horse, the signs of a coming dust storm. He understood work. He did not understand the layered complexities of a woman like Nora Vale. Her promise was a foreign language, but the urgency in her tone was something he recognized. It was the language of survival. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, the kind of nod he would give his herd to start them moving. It was not agreement so much as an acknowledgement of a task to be done, a decision made. When he asked, his voice a low rumble, 3 a.m, when the moon is down and the town is dead asleep, she answered quickly. The plan already formed. Behind the old church, its shadow will hide us. Bring 2 shovels, a coil of good rope, and a shielded lantern. The request for tools was something he understood. It grounded her mysterious promise in the familiar world of physical labor. Digging, hauling, building that was a language he spoke fluently. She must have seen the shift in his eyes, the flicker of reluctant acceptance. She gave a quick, almost imperceptible blink, a signal meant only for him. If you think for a second that I am lying to you, she added, her voice regaining its hushed intensity, you'll know. You'll hear it in my heartbeat. Before he could process that, she took a half-step back, preparing to leave. In that moment, as she adjusted the shawl around her shoulders, the faint light from the saloon window caught her hands, and Eli saw them, really saw them for the first time. They were not the hands of a singer. The skin was not soft and pale from a life indoors. Her fingers were long and capable. But it was the knuckles that caught his attention. They were etched with a network of fine, silvery scars, the kind a person gets from years of scraping against rock and hard earth. There were old calluses on her palms, worn smooth but still visible. These were the hands of someone who knew the earth intimately, someone who had dug and clawed and worked it. This one detail, this physical evidence, spoke to him more profoundly than her map or her promises. It was a truth her body told without a single word. She gave him one last, searching look, then turned and slipped back into the saloon, disappearing as quietly as she had appeared. Eli stood alone on the porch for a long moment, the wind his only companion. He replayed the encounter, the map, the threat, the strange promise, the sight of her hands. A seed of trust, tiny and fragile, had been planted in the barren ground of his skepticism. It was a desperate gamble, but his other options had already withered on the vine. He turned and walked toward his horse, his long strides eating up the dusty ground. As he swung himself into the saddle, he glanced back at the saloon one last time. He didn't see Kincaid or Nora, but in the deep shadows of the alleyway between the saloon and the blacksmith's shop, a darker patch of darkness detached itself from the wall. It was the silhouette of a man, still and watchful, his face hidden by the night. The figure stood there for a beat, then melted back into the blackness. They had been watched. The night's work was already more dangerous than he knew. The 3-hour ride to Widow's Back was a journey through a landscape bleached by starlight. The punishing heat of the day had bled out of the land, leaving behind a surprising, biting cold that found its way through the weave of Eli's denim jacket. The world was stripped of color, rendered in shades of charcoal and silver. The only sounds were the soft thud of their horses' hooves on the packed earth, and the whisper of the night wind through the skeletal branches of greasewood and sage. The air was thick with the clean, sharp scent of that wild sage, an ancient perfume that spoke of resilience and secrets held deep in the soil. They tethered the horses in a small arroyo where they would be hidden from view, then proceeded on foot, carrying the tools. The ground beneath their boots was a mix of hardpan and loose, sandy soil that shifted with each step, a soft, rhythmic shush like the land breathing in its sleep. Eli walked with the easy, ground-covering stride of a man who spent more time on his own feet than in a chair. Nora kept pace beside him, her movements just as certain, her body held with a coiled readiness he was beginning to recognize. They stopped at the base of the low, rounded hill the map had named Widow's Back. It was unremarkable, a mere lump on the vast, dark plain. The stars overhead were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds, so bright they seemed close enough to touch, in their cold, distant light. Nora turned to face him. The shielded lantern she carried cast a small pool of amber light on the ground at their feet, leaving their faces in shadow. "Before we break ground," she said, her voice low and steady, "you need to understand the terms of my map." Eli shifted the weight of the shovels on his shoulder. "I thought the terms were trust." "They are," she confirmed, "but trust needs proof. You need to learn how I tell the truth." She set the lantern down carefully, then took a small step closer to him. Before he could react or guess her intent, she took his right hand. His hand was large, rough, and stained with the earth. Hers, though calloused and scarred, was dwarfed by it. She guided his hand, palm open, and placed it flat against her chest, directly over her sternum. The act was so unexpected, so intimate, that for a moment Eli's entire body went rigid. The warmth of her radiated through the thin fabric of her dress, a startling, living heat in the cold night. He could feel the solid cage of her ribs beneath his palm. He started to pull his hand back, a reflex born of years of solitude, but her grip on his wrist was firm, insistent. "Just listen," she commanded softly, her eyes holding his in the darkness. "Don't think, just feel." He stood there, frozen in a state of profound awkwardness, a stranger touching a stranger in a way he hadn't touched another living soul since his wife had died. Then, beneath the layers of his discomfort, he felt it a steady, rhythmic thumping, the quiet, powerful engine of her life. "When I am afraid," she said, her voice a near whisper, "it beats fast, like a trapped bird. When I lie, it does the same. Fear and falsehood feel the same. But when I tell the truth, it is like this. Steady, even. Eli closed his eyes, forcing himself past the strangeness of the moment. He focused, listening with his hand the way he would listen for the sound of a sick calf's breathing in the dead of night, or for the telltale shift of a herd about to spook. He isolated the beat from the sound of the wind, from the frantic pounding of his own heart in his ears. It was just as she said, steady, rhythmic, unwavering. A slow, strong beat that spoke of a deep calm. It was the truest thing he had felt in a very long time. He slowly withdrew his hand, and she let him. The connection was broken, but the impression of that steady rhythm remained on his skin. He looked at her not as a saloon singer, not as a woman with a strange proposition, but as a person who had just handed him a key. He gave a single, sharp nod. The language was still foreign, but he was beginning to understand the grammar. "Where do we start?" he asked. Nora picked up the lantern, its light illuminating a deep, jagged crack in the earth at their feet, one of the thousands of fissures the drought had opened. "Here," she said, "the land is hurt. Sometimes the wound shows you where the life is." They began to dig. The work was hard. The ground a stubborn mix of baked clay and stone. The only sounds were the scrape and bite of their steel shovels and their own controlled breathing. They fell into a natural rhythm, working in tandem without needing to speak. One would break the ground, the other would clear the loose earth. They followed the path of the fissure as it snaked its way up the gentle slope of the hill. Every few yards, Nora would stop, kneel, and press her bare palm to the bottom of the shallow trench they were carving. She would close her eyes, her face a mask of concentration. Most times, she would shake her head and they would move on, but occasionally, she would pause, then take a dry twig and push it into the ground. "The earth is cooler here," she would whisper, a little dampness, far down. They were marking a trail only she could read, a secret path written in temperature and texture. As they worked their way higher, the moon set, and the darkness deepened, absolute and profound. The starlight was their only guide. The night grew colder still. It was Eli who heard it first. A small sound, out of place in the rhythmic silence of their work. A single pebble, dislodged from the crest of the hill above them, ticking as it bounced off the rocky ground. Tick, 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 scrape. In the vast, silent darkness, the sound was as loud as a gunshot. Eli's reaction was not thought, but pure instinct, honed by years of living in a land where danger was a constant shadow. In one fluid motion, he dropped his shovel and lunged for Nora, his arm wrapping around her waist. He pulled her down with him, tumbling into the shallow trench they had just dug, shielding her body with his own. They hit the hard ground a fraction of a second before a deafening crack split the night. A hot, angry whine sliced through the air directly above them, a sound like a giant hornet tearing the fabric of the dark. It was followed by a sharp thwump as the bullet slammed into the brim of Eli's hat, which had been knocked from his head in the fall. The impact spun it through the air and sent it skittering into the rocks. They lay frozen in the dirt, the sharp smell of cordite hanging in the cold air. Eli's arm was still clamped around Nora, his hand pressed flat against her back, and through the rough wool of her shawl. He felt it. Her heart. It was no longer the steady, even rhythm he had felt before. It was a frantic, wild hammering, a desperate, panicked beat that slammed against her ribs and telegraphed itself into his palm. It was the pure, unfiltered terror of a life that had come within an inch of being extinguished. She had pressed her face into the dirt, her breath held tight in her lungs. He felt the rapid-fire pulse thundering through her, proof of her words made real by a bullet in the dark. Slowly, as the seconds stretched into an eternity and no second shot came, he felt the frantic rhythm begin to subside, the wild hammering softened, the pace slowed, and the steady, even beat began to reassert itself, like a pendulum finding its swing after being violently shaken. He felt her take a single, ragged breath, then another, this one more controlled. She was consciously calming the fear, mastering the animal panic inside her. He had just read her body. He knew the truth of her fear, and he knew the truth of her control. Eli slowly released her and pushed himself up onto one elbow, his revolver appearing in his hand as if by magic. He peered over the edge of the trench into the oppressive darkness. He could see nothing, hear nothing but the wind. The watcher was skilled, hidden in the rocks and junipers at the top of the low hill. Instead of firing blindly, Eli raised his pistol and pointed it toward the empty sky. Well away from the crest of the hill, he squeezed the trigger. The resulting blast was a roar that echoed off the distant mountains, a defiant answer to the assassin's whisper. It was not an attack, but a declaration. We know you are there. We are armed. We are not easy prey. He listened, every nerve ending alive. He heard a rustle of movement, the sound of a boot scraping on stone, then the sound of someone retreating, moving quickly but carefully away from the hill. The watcher was gone. They waited in silence for a long time, letting the adrenaline drain away. Finally, Nora pushed herself up, her face pale in the starlight. She looked at Eli, her eyes wide. He holstered his pistol and retrieved his hat. He ran his finger along the new tear in the felt brim. "Kincaid doesn't like sharing," he said, his voice a low growl. He climbed out of the trench and, moving with quiet purpose, made his way to the spot where he'd heard the watcher retreat. He knelt, holding the shielded lantern low to the ground. There, in a patch of soft dust, was a single, clear boot print. It was from a town-made boot, not a rider's. And on the heel, pressed into the metal plate, was a distinct, unmistakable letter, a capital K. He returned to Nora's side. He didn't need to show her the print. She saw the answer in his eyes. Without a word, they picked up their shovels. The work was no longer just about hope. It was about defiance. They dug deeper now, focusing on the last spot Nora had marked. The ground was softer here. With each shovelful, a new scent began to rise from the earth. It was a smell he hadn't experienced in months, a smell so potent it was almost a taste. It was the cool, clean smell of dampness, of deep earth that had never been touched by the sun. It was the smell of a promise. His shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. He scraped away the dirt and found not bedrock, but a layer of smooth, bluish stone, slick to the touch, and from a tiny fissure in the stone, something was seeping. He held the lantern closer. A single drop of water welled up, caught the light like a liquid diamond, and trickled down the face of the rock. It was followed by another, and another, a slow, miraculous bleed from the veins of the earth. Nora knelt beside him, dipping her finger into the tiny stream. She brought it to her lips, her eyes closing. A small, weary smile touched her mouth, cracking the dry skin. "By dawn," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion, "you'll believe the body knows the way." Eli worked for the next hour with a silent, focused intensity. He used a length of sturdy bamboo he'd brought, split in half, to create a narrow channel, guiding the slow trickle of water into a deeper hollow he'd dug. He packed clay around it, creating a small, hidden basin. He then took a flat, weathered piece of board from his saddle and laid it over the opening, covering it with dirt and rocks until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. He wove a length of rope through a hole in the board, a hidden handle that would allow them to pull it free. The secret now lay beneath the earth, breathing quietly in the dark. Dawn did not creep over Widow's back. It carved its way into existence. The first light was a blade of pale, cold silver laid against the dark ridge of the eastern mountains. It sliced the horizon, separating night from day with a clean, sharp line. That light spilled across the high desert, not with a gentle warmth, but with a stark, revealing clarity. It touched the peaks of the rocks, casting long, sharp-edged shadows that looked like gashes in the earth. It was a merciless light, one that exposed every flaw, every crack, every sign of the land's long suffering. In that thin, surgical light, A small, impossible plume of vapor rose from the ground where Eli and Nora had worked. It was a ghost of a breath in the cold air, a faint mist that curled from the hidden mouth of the bamboo pipe. It was the exhalation of the living earth, a sign of the secret they had buried. They had not slept. They had sat in the cold, backs against a rock, sharing the silence, watching the stars fade. Now, as the day began, Eli moved with a stiff, deliberate grace. He knelt by their hidden work, his large frame casting a long shadow. With careful movements, he lifted the weathered board, the hidden rope handle cool in his grasp. The small basin he had dug was half full, the water a perfect dark mirror reflecting the sliver of emerging sky. He cupped his hands, dipping them into the basin. The water was shockingly cold, a jolt of pure life against his skin. He brought his hands to his face, the water smelling of wet stone and clean earth. He washed away the grime and exhaustion of the night, the grit of the gunfight, the dust of months of despair. He sluiced the water over his neck and through his hair. And as he did so, Nora, watching from a few feet away, saw that his hands were trembling. It was not a tremor from the cold or from weariness. It was a deep, profound shudder that seemed to rise from the very center of his being, a physical manifestation of an emotion too immense and too foreign for him to process in any other way. It was the tremor of a man starving for months who had just been given his first piece of bread. He stood up, water dripping from his jaw, his face raw and clean in the new light. He looked at the land around him, at the thirsty plains stretching into the distance, and for the first time in years, the view was not a portrait of his own failure. Nora took a step toward him. She did not speak. Words would have been too loud in the sacred quiet of this moment. Instead, she reached out and gently touched the back of his hand where it hung at his side. Her fingers were cool, her touch feather-light. Yet it landed on him with the weight of a solemn vow. She felt the landscape of his skin, the thick, protective calluses built by years of handling rope and wood and iron, the network of old scars, white against his sun-darkened skin, each a silent story of a wire fence, a slipped tool, a fight with an uncooperative beast. And beneath it all, she felt a steady, radiating warmth. It was the warmth of a banked fire, a life that had been burning low but had never gone out. In that single fleeting touch, a promise was made and accepted, a pact of shared survival that had no need for language. He looked down at her hand on his, then met her eyes. The guard was down, just for a second, and she saw the deep well of his exhaustion, his grief, and now, a fragile, newborn hope. "You won't sell this spring?" Nora said. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a statement of fact, a reading of the man she had just touched. Eli's throat worked. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Only for those who still live decently," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. Their unspoken agreement solidified into a plan. They knew Kincaid would be looking for them. They knew the boot print meant he had a man, maybe more than one, who wasn't afraid to use a gun. The spring was their secret, but it was also their greatest vulnerability. "One of us stays," Eli said, his voice regaining its practical edge. "Always. We take shifts. An hour for you to rest, an hour for me." "And we cover our tracks," Nora added. "Already scanning the ground. No one can know we were here." They spent the next hour meticulously erasing the signs of their presence. They used juniper branches to sweep the earth, blurring their footprints and the marks of their digging. They scattered loose pebbles and dust over the area until it looked as untouched and desolate as the rest of the hill. They worked together with an easy, unspoken rhythm, two parts of a single, functioning machine. As the sun finally cleared the mountains, bathing the valley in a pale gold, a long, mournful sound echoed from the distance. The train whistle, it was the sound of the town waking up, of the world Kincaid controlled coming back to life. Down in Dry Laurel, in his tidy office at the rail depot, Cole Kincaid was not having a good morning. He stood before the large, brass-rimmed pressure gauge connected to his main water tank. The needle, which should have been steady in the green zone, was hovering just inside the yellow. trembling like a nervous animal. It had dropped significantly during the night, an anomaly that made no sense. He had checked the pump himself. It was functioning perfectly. He had walked the line to the tank. There were no leaks. It was as if a portion of his supply had simply vanished into thin air. He struck the side of the gauge with his knuckles, a sharp, angry rap, but the needle refused to obey. He let out a string of low, vicious curses, his polished composure cracking under the pressure of this inexplicable failure. The water was his power, his control. Any threat to it was a threat to him. Back on Widow's Back, ignorant of the precise effect of their discovery, Eli and Nora prepared to part ways. They had a plan. He would take the first watch. She would ride back toward town, rest, and gather what news she could before returning to relieve him. Eli walked to his horse and unstrapped a coil of rope from his saddle. It was his best lariat, braided from fine horsehair, strong and supple. He had braided it himself over a long winter years ago. It had never failed him. He measured out half its length and, with a sharp flick of his knife, cut it cleanly in two. He held the thick, smooth coil out to her. "Good tools," he said, his voice low. "Should be used by good people." Nora looked at the rope, then at his face. She understood the weight of the gesture. For a man like Eli, his tools were an extension of himself. To give away half of his best rope was like giving away a piece of his own competence, his own self-reliance. It was an act of supreme trust. She accepted the coil, its familiar weight settling in her hand. Then, in a swift, answering motion, she reached to the small of her back and drew a knife from a concealed sheath. It was not a kitchen knife. It was a dagger, its blade lean and sharp, its handle wrapped in worn leather. It was a tool of last resort, a weapon of survival. She held it out to him, handle first. "Collateral," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Something to be returned to me if I betray you." Eli looked at the blade gleaming in the morning sun, then at her steady, unflinching eyes. He understood this language perfectly. This was a contract written in steel and horsehair, sealed by the code of the frontier. He took the dagger, its handle fitting surprisingly well in his large hand. He slid it into the top of his boot without a word. "The old schoolhouse," he said, his voice gruff. "By the dry creek bed. Meet me there after sundown." She nodded. "I'll be there." They mounted their horses. Without a backward glance at each other, they turned their animals in opposite directions. Nora rode east, toward the rising sun and the town. Eli rode west, deeper into the broken lands, planning to circle back and take up a hidden position where he could watch the spring. Their separation was a practical necessity, a way to ensure no one could follow one to the other. As Nora topped a low rise a mile from the hill, she risked a look back. She could no longer see Eli. The landscape had already swallowed him, but she saw something else, far in the distance, on the main track that led from town, a rising cloud of dust, still small and faint, but growing steadily. It was a wagon, moving fast. Even from this distance, she could make out the shapes of the men on the seat. One was driving, and beside him, and in the wagon bed behind, sat two other figures, broad-shouldered men holding rifles, their faces unfamiliar and hard. Cole Kincaid was no longer sending a single shadow in the night. He was coming with an army. The abandoned schoolhouse stood like a forgotten memory against the pale afternoon sky. Its roof sagged in the middle, a tired spine giving way to time. The bell tower was empty, its rope long since rotted away. Eli approached with caution, circling the building once, his eyes scanning the dusty ground for fresh tracks, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. He saw only the old, wind-scoured prints of coyotes and rabbits. Satisfied he was alone, he dismounted, looping Flint's reins around the skeletal remains of a swing set. He pushed open the door, which protested with a long, agonized groan. The air inside was thick and still, heavy with the smell of dry rot, chalk dust, and the faint, papery scent of decaying books. Sunlight did not fill the room. It sliced it. Sharp. Brilliant shafts of light cut through holes in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes and landing on the warped floorboards in stark, geometric patterns. Everything was askew. Small wooden desks and benches were tilted at odd angles, as if their occupants had fled in a great hurry. At the front of the room, the blackboard was a canvas of gray mildew, the ghostly remnants of a long-faded lesson still visible beneath the bloom. Nora was already there. She sat at the teacher's desk, which was surprisingly level, her back to him. She didn't seem to have heard him enter. She was focused on a piece of slate she'd propped up, scratching at it with a shard of chalk she must have found on the floor. He closed the door behind him, the sound of it latching echoing with a startling finality in the silence. She turned, not with a start, but with a slow, deliberate motion. There were dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, but her gaze was sharp, alive with an intellectual fire that seemed out of place in the decaying room. "Kincaid's men are combing the flats east of here," she said without preamble, her voice a low murmur that the thick, dusty air seemed to absorb. "They think we're hiding in the rocks. It buys us time." Eli nodded, setting a small canteen and a pouch of jerky on one of the less crooked desks. "The spring is safe. I covered my approach." "Good," she said, turning back to her slate. "Because hiding the spring isn't enough. We can't spend the rest of our lives hauling water in the dark and dodging rifle fire. We have to break his control, all of it." She motioned him closer. He walked to the front of the room, his boots stirring up small clouds of dust. He looked at the slate. It wasn't a map of the territory. It was a detailed, technical drawing, a cross-section of a large water tank, complete with pipes, valves, and pressure gauges, all meticulously labeled. He recognized it instantly. It was Kincaid's tower. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. This was not the work of a saloon singer. "I wasn't always a singer," she said, as if reading his thoughts. She tapped a specific valve on the drawing with the chalk shard. "My father was a surveyor for the Union Pacific. I was his assistant for 5 years. I learned how to read schematics, how to calculate pressure and flow, how to spot a weakness in a system." She looked up from the drawing, and, for a fleeting moment, a different woman was looking at him, a younger, more hopeful woman who had once believed in the clean logic of engineering. The singing was just what I did after, a way to listen to a town before it knew I was there. The admission settled between them, rearranging his understanding of her. She wasn't an opportunist who had stumbled upon a secret. She was a strategist who had been looking for a battlefield. Then he looked away from her, his gaze falling on one of the small, empty desks. A pang of memory, sharp and unwelcome, went through him. His wife, Sarah, had been a teacher in a room much like this one, back in a greener, wetter place, before the drought had driven them west, before the sickness. "There was a man like Kincaid where we were before," Eli said, his voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the room. He didn't look at Nora. He spoke to the ghosts in the dust motes. He controlled the only clean well after the river went bad, sold the water for twice the fair price. We couldn't afford it every week. Sarah, she drank from our own well, said it was fine, just a little cloudy. He stopped, his jaw working. He didn't need to say the word typhoid. The name of the disease was a scar on his memory. He had hated the man who guarded the well then, but it was a distant, abstract hatred. It was Sarah's slow, fevered decline that had forged his hate into a cold, hard thing he carried inside him. It was the reason he sought solitude. It was the reason he would never, ever trust a man who put a lock on water. Nora was silent. She didn't offer condolences or pity. He was grateful for that. She simply waited, giving his quiet confession the space and respect it deserved. When he finally looked back at her, her eyes were filled with a fierce, terrible understanding. His past had just become part of their shared present. "Then we do this for her, too," Nora said softly. She tapped the schematic again, her focus absolute. Here's the plan. We use his own system against him. We take his water to give the people their water. The plan was simple in its concept, but audacious in its execution. The evening train, the one that brought the mail, was also the one that resupplied Kincaid's steam pump with coal. For the 10 minutes that the train was stopped at the depot, the pump was shut down for the coal transfer. During that brief window, the entire town's water supply depended solely on the pressure from the main holding tank. If the pressure dropped suddenly during that handover, Nora explained, her finger tracing a pipe, Kincaid will panic. The railroad brass is on that train. He can't afford to look incompetent. He'll rush to the tank himself to fix the problem, thinking it's a mechanical failure. Her voice was tight with precision. And when he gets there, we'll be waiting. Not to fight him, but to expose him. Nora then began to teach him, her voice low and clinical. You've only seen him when he's in control. You need to know what he looks like when he's not. When he lies, his shoulders go stiff. He pulls them back, like he's bracing for a physical blow. And when he's afraid, truly afraid, he touches the ring on his right hand, a gold signet ring. He'll rub his thumb over it, back and forth, a nervous habit he probably doesn't even know he has. Eli listened, absorbing the information. He had spent his life reading the subtle language of animals, the flick of an ear, the shift of weight that signals fear or aggression. He had never thought to apply the same observation to men. And what about his men, Eli asked. The two with the rifles? That's the other part of the plan. She said, we need a diversion, something big enough to pull them away from the tank. It was his turn to teach. He took a piece of the horsehair rope she'd returned to him and, in the dusty light, began to work it with his scarred hands. There's a knot, he said, his fingers moving with an ingrained, fluid knowledge. A vaquero release knot. You can tie a gate shut with it, and it will hold against a stampede. But if you pull the release loop from 50 feet away with a second line, the entire knot falls apart instantly. He showed her how to form the intricate loops, how to pass the rope through itself to create the locking mechanism. Her hands, he noticed again, were quick and sure. She learned the complex knot after only 2 demonstrations, her fingers mimicking his movements with an engineer's precision. When she pulled it tight, the knot was a compact, beautiful puzzle of braided horsehair. It was as elegant as a signature. Their plan now had 2 more components. First, they would spend the afternoon running a narrow, secondary pipeline, a series of hollowed-out logs Eli had scavenged from the hidden spring on Widow's Back down to the dry cattle trough behind the schoolhouse. It would be a slow, patient trickle. But by nightfall, the trough would be full. The promise of free, clean water would be an irresistible lure for every thirsty herd in the area, creating the perfect diversion. Second, Nora took a piece of foolscap from her saddlebag and a small vial of ink. With a crow quill pen, she began to write, her script neat and official-looking. It was a letter addressed to Cole Kincaid. It spoke of concerns from local ranchers about water quality and distribution, and it requested a meeting to discuss the matter civilly. It was signed, the Dry Laurel Citizens Committee. There is no committee, Eli stated, watching her. There will be. After tonight, she said, not looking up. She carefully folded the letter. I'll have the preacher's son deliver it. Kincaid will dismiss it as the ramblings of desperate men, but it will plant a seed. It will make him think the ranchers are organizing, and it will make him angry. The afternoon passed in a silent symphony of shared labor. The only sounds in the schoolhouse were the faint scratching of Nora's pen, the soft whisper of the rope as Eli tested the knot again and again, and, from the walls, the tiny, skittering footsteps of mice. In the quiet, Eli became aware of another sound, a rhythm that had been there all along, the steady, even beat of his own heart, and, he imagined, of hers. It was a new kind of clock, marking not the slow passage of a day, but the quickening pace toward a confrontation at dusk. When the preparations were complete, a deep silence fell over the room once more. The sun was getting low, its light turning from gold to a deeper, burnished orange. The shafts of light on the floor had lengthened, stretching toward the door. Eli found himself simply watching her as she stood by the window, peering out a crack in the boarded-up glass, her silhouette dark against the dying light. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the straight, proud line of her back. He saw the mind behind her eyes, constantly working, planning, anticipating. He felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a feeling that went beyond gratitude or partnership. It was a clumsy, unpracticed emotion, and he had no words for it. He took a half-step toward her, a vague intention of saying something to acknowledge the enormity of what they were doing, of the trust that had been built in this dusty, forgotten room. But the words wouldn't come. They were foreign tools for which he had no skill. He stopped. He had offered her his rope, and she had offered him her knife. They had shared their pasts not with long speeches, but with short, painful truths. Their partnership was built on action, not on talk. He backed away, retreating into the familiar comfort of his own silence. It was better this way. Words could be misunderstood. The clean, simple language of a well-tied knot, a well-drawn plan, a shared look of understanding that was a language he could trust. The sun bled out across the western plains, dyeing the sky the color of old, weeping rust. Below it, the dry laurel water tower stood tall and skeletal, a dark sentinel casting a long, skeletal shadow that stretched across the iron train tracks and touched the edge of the town. It was the shadow of Cole Kincaid himself, long and oppressive, a daily reminder of who held the town in his fist. From the hayloft of the livery stable, 100 yards away, Eli and Nora watched. The air was still, heavy with the coming coolness of night and the palpable tension of their own making. Below them, the town was a collection of muted sounds, a dog barking, the faint clink of glasses from the saloon, the weary sigh of a community holding its breath. Then came the new sound, a distant rumble that grew into a rhythmic chuffing and the sharp, lonely cry of a whistle. The evening train was on time. This was the signal. Nora, lying prone at the edge of the loft, reached down and pulled a thin, nearly invisible tripwire she had spent the afternoon rigging. The wire ran from the loft, through a series of rusty pulleys under the boardwalk, to a small, custom-filed release pin on a secondary drainage valve at the base of the tower, a valve Kincaid used for maintenance, a valve Nora knew about from the faded schematics in her memory. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a low, hungry gurgle came from the tower, a deep, guttural sound like a giant throat being cleared. It was the sound of pressure being devoured. Inside the depot office, Cole Kincaid heard it too. He glanced at his pressure gauge. The needle was no longer steady. It was shuddering, then dropping, falling from the green into the yellow with an alarming speed. He swore, a low, vicious sound, and lunged for the pump's bypass lever, pulling it hard. The needle only dipped faster. His two hired gunmen, lounging near the door, straightened up, their hands moving instinctively to their holstered pistols. They were large, quiet men, their faces impassive and sun-cracked, bought and paid for to enforce their employer's will. They scanned the empty rail yard, looking for a threat they couldn't see. Kincaid slammed his fist on the console. "Find it!" he snarled. From the hayloft, Nora watched him through a small spyglass. He was shouting at his men, his face contorted in a mask of fury and confusion, and she saw it. The tell. His shoulders were pulled back, ramrod straight, so tight they looked like they might burst through his clean coat. She lowered the spyglass, a grim satisfaction in her eyes. She glanced at Eli, who was watching Kincaid's silhouette through the depot window. "He's lying?" Nora whispered, the words barely audible. "He's telling them it's a mechanical fault, but he thinks it's sabotage. His body is braced for a fight." Now, it was Eli's turn. While Kincaid's attention was fixed on the failing tower, Eli slipped out the back of the livery and melted into the shadows. He moved with the quiet, deadly grace of a predator, his path taking him along the dry creek bed to the abandoned schoolhouse at the edge of town. There, a small herd of thirsty longhorns, drawn by the impossible promise of a full trough, milled restlessly behind a makeshift gate. They could smell the water from the secret pipeline, their low, anxious bellows a testament to their desperate thirst. Eli took the vaquero rope in his hand. He gave the release loop a single, sharp tug. The intricate knot he had tied earlier dissolved into nothing. The gate swung wide. The cattle hesitated for a moment, then surged forward as one. The trickle of water in the trough was not enough to satisfy them, but the scent was a maddening lure. A chorus of deep, desperate bellows ripped through the evening quiet, a sound of raw, animal need that was more compelling than any fire bell. It was the sound of the drought itself given voice. Heads popped out of windows all over Dry Laurel. Men spilled out of the saloon, squinting toward the commotion. Women came to their porches, wiping their hands on their aprons. They saw the cattle swarming the old schoolhouse, a chaotic horn tide of frustration. They saw Kincaid and his men burst from the depot, rifles ready, and they saw the great water tower, the symbol of their town's subjugation, behaving strangely, groaning and shuddering as if in its death throes. Kincaid saw his control unraveling on two fronts. The cattle were a nuisance, but the tower was his throne. Forget the cows, he bellowed to his men. It's the tower, someone's at the tower, protect the property. He gave the order. The two gunmen raised their rifles and fired. Not at the cattle, but at the base of the tower, aiming to scare off any saboteur who might be hiding in the shadows of its massive legs. Bullets, loud and sharp, bit into the heavy timbers. Wood splintered. The sound of gunfire shocked the gathering townsfolk into a fearful silence. From his position near the creek bed, Eli raised his own rifle. He did not aim at the men. He aimed higher. He squeezed the trigger, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. His shot was true. The bullet didn't hit wood or iron, but an old, frayed rope that held a small maintenance platform halfway up the tower. The rope snapped. The platform, unbalanced, crashed down against a large feeder pipe with a clang of protesting metal. The pipe, already under stress from the pressure imbalance, ruptured at a weak joint. A great fan of water erupted from the side of the tower, a high-pressure spray that hissed and roared, drenching everything in a sudden, violent downpour. It wasn't the clean release of a fully opened valve. It was a wound, bleeding the tower's lifeblood out onto the thirsty ground. This was Nora's chance. While Kincaid and his men were momentarily stunned by the new chaos, she darted from the hayloft. She ran, low and fast, a fleeting shadow in the deepening twilight. She reached the tower's access ladder, her boots splashing in the spreading pool of water. She began to climb. The rungs were slick with water and algae. The spray from the ruptured pipe soaked her in seconds, plastering her hair to her face and her dress to her skin. She ignored it, her focus absolute. In her hand, she clutched the heavy horsehair rope Eli had given her. Her goal was the main release valve, a great iron wheel near the top of the tower that would dump the entire tank. Her hands, already raw from the night of digging, scraped against the splintered wood of the ladder. As she neared the valve, she looped the rope around the wheel's thick spokes, her fingers flying as she formed the vaquero release knot. She pulled the heavy, wet rope tight, the friction of the horsehair against her skin burning her palms like fire. The release loop was in place, a long tail of rope dangling toward the ground. One of the gunmen had recovered his senses. He saw her dark shape ascending the ladder. There he shouted, and began to climb after her, his rifle slung over his back. He was faster than her, heavier. The ladder shook under his weight. Nora could hear his grunting breaths getting closer. She was out of time. She secured the knot and, instead of climbing higher, she braced herself. As his head came level with her boots, she kicked out, not at him, but at the ladder itself, shoving it away from the tower's frame. The ladder, already slick and unstable, swung outward. The gunman, caught off balance with only one hand on the rung, let out a cry of surprise as his grip failed. He fell, landing with a heavy, wet splash in the deep, sandy mud that had formed at the base of the tower. His rifle flew from his shoulder, disappearing into the muck. He was out of the fight. But Nora was now trapped, clinging to the ladder as it swung back and slammed into the tower. Below, Kincaid was shouting, his other gunman trying to get a clear shot. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the roar of the water, the thunder of hooves. Eli, astride Flint, charged out of the twilight, his face a mask of grim determination. He rode directly into the deluge, the horse unafraid, its eyes wide and wild. In his hand, his lariat was already a spinning, open loop. He rode past the tower, and in a single, fluid motion born of 1,000 perfect throws, he cast the rope. The loop sailed through the spray, a perfect circle that dropped cleanly over Nora's head and shoulders. She grabbed it, holding on tight. "Let go!" Eli yelled. She trusted him. She released her grip on the ladder, and for a heart-stopping second, she was falling. Then the rope snapped taut, the force of it pulling her from the air. She swung clear of the tower, landing side-saddle behind Eli on the horse's broad, wet back. Their bodies collided, the impact knocking the breath from both of them. He spurred the horse, and they galloped out of the spray and into the rail yard, leaving a scene of chaos behind them. They reined the horse to a halt in the center of the growing crowd. The townspeople, who had been watching in stunned silence, now began to stir. They surged forward, surrounding the horse, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, dangerous hope. In the sudden downpour from the wounded tower, the children, seeing only a miraculous summer rain, began to laugh and dance in the spreading puddles. But the adults were silent. They looked at the water pooling in the street, at its murky, rust-tinged color. They looked at Eli and Nora, soaked and breathing heavily, a unit forged in defiance, and they looked at each other, a silent, collective understanding passing between them. They had all been told the railroad's water was clean. This deluge told a different story. Cole Kincaid stood alone, drenched and defeated. His gunman was struggling in the mud. His tower was bleeding, and the entire town was bearing witness to his public humiliation. His authority had been shattered. He turned, his face as tight and pale as a drumhead, and stalked back to the dark sanctuary of his office. His face looked like a piece of dry leather that, with one more twist, would crack wide open. The chaos of the water tower had barely settled back into the dust when a new alarm ripped through the late-night quiet. It was a different cry, older and more primal than the hiss of water or the crack of a rifle. It was the cry of fire. A malevolent orange glow bloomed against the black sky, pulsing like a diseased heart. The railroad warehouse, a long, low building that held the town's vital supplies and Kincaid's operational records, was being eaten alive by flames. Black smoke, thick and greasy, billowed into the night, carrying the angry roar of a fire that was feeding on something more than dry wood. By the time Eli and Nora reached the edge of the rail yard, a crowd had already gathered, their faces a gallery of horror and exhaustion painted in flickering firelight. Cole Kincaid was there, standing on a crate, his clean clothes seeming to repel the soot that was already settling on everyone else. He was not fighting the fire. He was fanning the flames of accusation. "This is what lawlessness brings," he shouted, his voice ringing with false authority, pointing a damning finger at the burning building. "The saboteurs who attacked our town's water supply have now turned to outright destruction. They would see us starve, see us burn, rather than accept progress." His words were aimed at the crowd, but his eyes were searching for Eli and Nora. He wanted to pin this on them, to turn them from heroes into villains before the sun rose. But Nora wasn't listening to his words. She was smelling the air. It wasn't the clean, sharp scent of a wood fire, nor the familiar smell of kerosene. It was something else, a resinous, chemical odor that pricked at her memory. It was the heavy, aromatic scent of pine oil. She had smelled it once before, years ago, when a railroad crew had used it to clean a heavily greased engine block, a solvent, highly, dangerously flammable. She grabbed Eli's arm, her eyes wide with a terrible realization. "It's a trap," she hissed, her voice lost in the roar of the blaze. He set it himself, the water quality ledgers, the shipping manifests, all the proof of his negligence. It's all in that office. He's burning the evidence. The crowd was a mix of fear and confusion, Kincaid's words twisting their loyalties. But a few men stood apart, their faces hard and thoughtful. 3 ranchers, men who had lost cattle to the drought and their savings to Kincaid's fees, watched Eli, their eyes asking a silent question. Eli met their gazes. He didn't need to speak. He simply turned and ran toward the warehouse door. After a heartbeat's hesitation, the 3 ranchers followed him. The main loading door was thick oak, barred from the inside. The 4 men lowered their shoulders and slammed into it as one. The wood groaned but held. They hit it again. The impact a dull thud against the fire's roar. On the 3rd try, the frame splintered with a sound like breaking bones, and the door flew inward, vomiting a wave of superheated smoke and stinging embers. They recoiled, choking, their lungs filled with fire. The smoke was a physical entity, a thick, blinding monster that clawed at their throats. The ranchers doubled over, their coughs deep and ragged, like the sound of stones being ground together. Eli fought for breath, his eyes streaming, but his gaze was fixed on the inferno inside. "The office is on the left," Nora screamed from behind them. Before he could stop her, she dipped a rag from a nearby rain barrel, tied it around her face, and dropped to the ground. She crawled through the broken doorway, disappearing into the churning smoke. Eli followed without a second thought, shouting at the other men to stay back. He stayed low, beneath the worst of the smoke, the floorboards hot enough to feel through the soles of his boots. He could barely see, the air a swirling vortex of black and orange. The heat was a living thing, pressing in from all sides, sucking the air from his lungs. He found Nora near a toppled desk, pulling at the handle of a heavy, iron lockbox, her face a mask of fierce determination. "It's stuck," she yelled, her voice muffled by the rag. He put his hands over hers. The metal was searingly hot, even through his calloused skin. Together, they pulled. The box scraped along the floor, fighting them every inch. From above came a terrifying, splintering groan. The main roof beam, engulfed in flames, was beginning to give way. "Move!" Eli roared. They dragged the box clear of the desk just as a shower of fiery debris rained down where they had been kneeling. Nora stumbled, her hands raw and burned, her grip failing. She fell to her knees, gasping for air. At that same moment, a massive section of the flaming roof above her tore free with a sound of final, catastrophic failure. Eli didn't have time to pull her away. He acted on pure instinct. He threw himself forward, covering her small frame with his own body. He ripped his heavy duster coat from his shoulders and held it over her head, creating a pathetic, fragile shield against the inferno. The roof came down. A wave of heat and force slammed into him, driving the air from his lungs, burning timbers, flaming shingles, and a rain of red-hot nails struck his back. He grunted in pain as the embers landed, some burning straight through his thick cotton shirt. The smell of singed fabric was instantly replaced by the sharp, sickening scent of his own seared skin. He held his position, his muscles locked, absorbing the punishment, the firelight from the collapsing structure illuminating the old, faded scars on his back just before the new ones were burned into place. Then, as quickly as it started, the collapse was over. He pushed a smoldering beam off his legs and staggered to his feet, pulling Nora up with him. He was covered in soot, his shirt dotted with smoking holes, but he was moving. He half dragged, half carried her back toward the doorway, the precious lockbox clutched in her arms. They stumbled out into the night air, two apparitions emerging from the smoke. The crowd gasped. Outside, Cole Kincaid was in the middle of his performance, his voice ringing with indignation. These violent rebels, these enemies of progress, who would rather burn us down than build us up, he was shouting. He gestured dramatically toward the blaze, a picture of civic outrage. And as he did, Nora, Eli, and half the town saw it. His thumb. It was moving frantically, rubbing back and forth, over the gold signet ring on his finger. He was terrified. Nora ignored her own searing pain. She ignored the murmuring crowd. Her eyes scanned the faces until she found the one she was looking for, Reverend Townsend. He was a tall, thin man with a calm, weathered face. A man whose fairness was as solid and reliable as the stone foundation of his own church. He was already moving toward them, his expression one of deep concern. Nora pushed the hot iron box into his hands. The Reverend flinched but did not drop it. "Proof," Nora said, her voice a raw, ragged whisper. "Keep it safe. Don't let him have it." Townsend looked from the box to Kincaid, who had frozen mid-speech, his face paling as he saw the exchange. The Reverend looked at Nora's burned hands, at Eli's smoldering shirt, and he nodded slowly. He clutched the box to his chest as if it were the Holy Scripture itself and backed away into the crowd, protected by a silent, sudden wall of his parishioners. The proof was safe. The adrenaline that had sustained Eli finally gave out. The smoke he had inhaled settled in his lungs like a shroud. He swayed on his feet, his vision tunneling to a single point of light. The world tilted sideways, and he went down, first to his knees, then collapsing onto the dusty ground, his body convulsing in a terrible, racking cough. Nora was beside him in an instant. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, her own pain forgotten. "Eli, look at me," she commanded, her voice cutting through his haze. She grabbed his shoulders, forcing him into a sitting position. "Breathe with me. Listen." She put one of her burned, trembling hands flat against his chest, right over his heart. He flinched at the unexpected touch. "Listen to me," she repeated, her voice softer now, but with an unbreakable firmness. "Feel that that's steady. Match it. Breathe in. Now out. Follow my heart. In. Out." He was drowning, but her voice and the steady, rhythmic beat under her palm were a lifeline. He focused on it, on that simple, powerful rhythm of life. His ragged, panicked gasps began to slow, to match the cadence she was setting. He was still coughing, but the convulsions eased. He was breathing with her, anchored to her. The townspeople watched, silent and transfixed. They saw the raw, angry burns beginning to weep on Eli's back where his shirt had burned away. They saw Nora's hands, the skin red and blistering, shaking with pain, yet resting so steadily on his chest, refusing to let go. They saw an act of such profound, selfless care in the midst of the chaos that it overshadowed everything else. The fire in the warehouse, having consumed its fuel, began to die down. The great orange flames sank into a glowing red bed of embers. The roar softened to a final, exhausted sigh. What remained was a skeleton of charred timbers, a sky full of acrid smoke, and a silence that was heavier than any noise. And in that silence, a new story was born. It traveled not on the wind, but in the exchanged glances of the ranchers, in the hushed whispers of the women, in the solemn, knowing nods of the men who had seen the truth. Kincaid had accused, but the firelight had revealed a different reality. The new rumor, the one that would greet the dawn, was simple, and it was devastatingly true. They didn't burn the warehouse. They saved what was inside it. Sunday morning arrived, not with the peace of the Sabbath, but with the tense, electric hum of a coming storm. The church, a simple clapboard structure with a modest steeple, was not a house of worship today. It was a courtroom. The pews were packed, standing room was filled, and faces peered through the open windows from outside. The people of Dry Laurel, in their Sunday best, had come not for a sermon, but for a reckoning. The wind, relentless as ever, whistled through the cracks in the walls, a high, mournful sound that served as a constant reminder of the drought that was the root of this conflict. Dust motes danced in the slanted morning light that fell from the tall, narrow windows, illuminating a community on edge. At the front, before the simple wooden altar, stood Reverend Townsend. To his left sat Nora and Eli on a simple bench. Eli's back was straight, though every movement was a study in controlled pain from the burns. Nora's hands, wrapped in clean white bandages, rested in her lap. To the Reverend's right, alone on another bench, sat Cole Kincaid. He was dressed impeccably, as always, a stark contrast to the weary, work-worn congregation. But for the first time, his clothes could not hide the cracks in his composure. His face was a tight, pale mask. There was no judge, no jury in the traditional sense. The entire town was the jury, and Reverend Townsend was simply the voice of their collective conscience. He held up 2 glass jars of water. One was a murky, reddish-brown, with a visible layer of sediment at the bottom. The other was crystal clear. "This," the Reverend said, his voice calm and steady, filling the hushed church, "is the water from Mr. Kincaid's railroad tank. We drew it last night from the puddles in the street." A low murmur went through the crowd. "And this," he continued, holding up the clear jar, "is from a new spring, a gift, which Mr. Warren and Miss Vale have offered to share with the community." He paused, letting the visual evidence sink in. "I am not a chemist, but I know the difference between rust and life. I also have here," he placed the heavy iron lockbox on the altar, its scorched metal a testament to the night before. The ledgers saved from the fire. They show records of repeated pump failures due to corrosion. They show manifests for barrels of cheap, industrial-grade oil, the same oil that taints this water. They show that Mr. Kincaid knew his equipment was failing and his water was foul, yet he continued to sell it at an ever-increasing price. The murmur grew louder, angrier. Kincaid sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the lockbox as if it were a coiled snake. When the Reverend had finished, Nora stood. She walked to the center, her bandaged hands held loosely at her sides. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the calm, irrefutable logic of an engineer. "Last night, a man was sent to Widow's Back to kill us," she began, her gaze sweeping over the silent faces. "He failed, but he left a footprint behind, a boot with AK stamped on the heel." She looked directly at Kincaid's 2 gunmen, who stood grimly at the back of the church. One of them instinctively glanced down at his own footwear. "When we broke the tower," Nora continued, "it was not an act of random destruction. We targeted a weak pipe. A joint I knew from the railroad's own schematics was prone to rupture. The maintenance ladder was intentionally damaged, its rungs sawed partway through, a trap for anyone trying to fix the valve in a hurry." She pointed a bandaged finger toward Kincaid. "And the fire was started not with kerosene, but with pine oil solvent, a railroad supply stored in the warehouse office, right next to the evidence you wanted to destroy." She paused, her words hanging in the thick, dusty air. "These are not separate events. They are pieces of a single, broken thing. We are here today to set the bones straight." Then, it was Eli's turn. He rose slowly, painfully, and stood beside her. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the simple wooden cross on the altar, but his words were for everyone. "My wife, Sarah, died 3 years ago," he said, his voice a low, rough thing, scraped raw by memory and smoke. It held no plea for pity, no hint of complaint. It was a simple statement of a fact that had shaped his world. It was a hot season. The water turned bad. She got the fever. It took her a week. He drew a slow breath. "The man who owned the clean well, he said our credit was no good. We buried her on a Tuesday." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The entire room was utterly still, held captive by the profound, unadorned weight of his loss. Every man and woman in that church understood his story. They had lived on the edge of that same story themselves for months. Cole Kincaid could feel the tide of opinion turning against him, a silent, powerful current that threatened to sweep him away. He leaped to his feet, his composure finally shattering. "Lies, all of it," he shouted, his voice shrill and ugly in the quiet church. "This is a conspiracy by thieves and arsonists. They broke my tower. They burned my warehouse. They are the criminals here." As he spoke, his shoulders went rigid, pulling back as if he were bracing for a blow. His face was a mask of outrage, but his body was telling a different story. And his right hand, his betraying hand, flew to his left, his thumb beginning its frantic, desperate rubbing of the gold signet ring. A new kind of murmur swept through the congregation. It was not anger this time. It was recognition. Nora had given them the key, and now they were all watching the lie being made visible. Nora took a deliberate step forward, right into Kincaid's line of sight. And then she did the last thing anyone expected. She turned to Eli. In the sight of God and the entire town, she took his large, scarred hand and placed it flat against her own chest, over her heart. It was the same gesture from the dark night on the hill, but this was no secret. This was a public oath. The crowd gasped. The act was so intimate, so strange. It shocked them into absolute silence. "Listen," she said, her voice clear and strong, speaking only to Eli. "But for all to hear, I have told you what I know. I have shown you what I found. I am telling you now, before all these people, that Cole Kincaid is a liar and a thief who values his profit more than your lives." She held Eli's gaze, her own unwavering, "And I am telling you the truth." Eli stood perfectly still, his calloused palm resting against her, a conduit to the very core of her being. He felt it, the steady, even, powerful rhythm, the beat of a heart that was not afraid, the beat of a heart that was not lying. In that moment, surrounded by his neighbors, in the house of his God, he finally, completely, let go of the armor of his solitude. A hushed whisper spread through the pews. "The body doesn't know how to lie?" It was an old saying, a piece of frontier wisdom, and it had never felt more true. Cole Kincaid saw it. He saw the understanding dawn on Eli's face. He saw the silent, collective judgment in the eyes of the townspeople. His lies had crumbled, turned to dust by a truth that was not spoken, but felt. His face, already pale, turned a ghastly, ashen gray. He stumbled back and sank onto the bench. A man hollowed out. His power vanished. Reverend Townsend stepped forward into the silence. He did not need to call for a vote. He could read the verdict on every face in the room. "By the consensus of this community," he declared, his voice resonating with a newfound authority, "the railroad's exclusive control over the Dry Laurel water supply is hereby terminated. A town council of 5 ranchers will be formed to oversee the fair and equal distribution of all water, from all sources. Mr. Kincaid, you are relieved of your duties as station master, effective immediately. The railroad will be notified of our decision." There was no cheering, no shouting, just a single collective sound that filled the church. It was the sound of 100 people exhaling at once, a quiet, profound sigh of relief, like a corset that has been too tight for too long finally being loosened. In the midst of that quiet, Eli looked at Nora, truly looked at her. The firelight had shown him her courage. The smoke had shown him her compassion. Now, in the clear light of Sunday morning, he saw the woman who had brought truth back to a town dying of thirst. "I believe you," he said, his voice low and certain. Nora looked up at him, a small, weary smile touching her lips. The burns on her hands and the exhaustion in her eyes could not dim the steady light in her gaze. "Believing," she answered softly, "is living by it." A week passed. The quiet that settled over Dry Laurel was not an empty silence, but a living one, filled with new sounds. The rhythmic creak and splash of the new hand pump installed at the town well. The low, contented murmurs of cattle drinking their fill from troughs that were no longer empty. The distant, happy shouts of children. who had discovered the simple joy of splashing water on a hot afternoon. The wind still blew, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It carried the scent of wet earth and the faint, hopeful promise of new grass. The town had begun to heal. Change came on the afternoon stagecoach, which arrived in its usual cloud of dust and noise. The driver, a leathery man named Silas, handed down a single, important-looking letter addressed to Miss Nora Vale, care of the Dry Laurel Township. It had come from Dodge City. It bore the official seal of the Kansas Pacific Railway's Regional Water Authority. Nora took it to the small room she had rented above the general store. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the letter feeling heavy and foreign in her bandaged hands. The paper was thick and clean, the ink a bold, confident black. It was a formal offer of employment, acknowledging her uncommon expertise in practical hydrogeology. The railway was offering her the position of regional water inspector. The job came with a substantial salary, a housing stipend, and a railway pass. It was a life of clean streets, paid accounts, and professional respect. It was everything a sensible, forward-thinking woman could want. It was an escape. She read it twice, the words blurring slightly the second time. She could picture it a neat little house, a job where her mind was the only tool she needed, a future free of dust and bullets and the ghosts of other people's pasts. It was a safe harbor. That evening, she found Eli not at his ranch, but where he now spent most of his time on Widow's Back. He was reinforcing the small basin around the spring, lining it with carefully chosen flat stones, his movements slow and methodical. The burns on his back were healing, covered by a clean shirt, but she knew they still pained him. He had a look of deep, quiet concentration on his face, the look of a man rebuilding his world one stone at a time. He saw her approach, but didn't stop his work until she was standing beside him. He straightened up, wiping the mud from his hands onto his trousers. The setting sun cast their shadows long and thin behind them. She held out the letter. He took it, his brow furrowed in question. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly with the unfamiliar, official words. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her, his face unreadable. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle trickle of water from the bamboo pipe into the basin. "It's a good offer," he said at last, his voice a low rumble.
"Yes," she said, "it is."
More silence. He picked up another stone, weighed it in his hand, then set it back down, his work forgotten. He looked out over the valley, at the scattered lights of the ranches beginning to twinkle in the dusk. "Stay," he said. The word was not a plea. It was a statement, as solid and unadorned as the stones at his feet. He turned to look at her, his gaze direct. "We'll build a windmill. Right here. A tower to pull the water up for everyone. We'll share it fairly. No locks, no fees." He was not offering her a home, or a heart, or a future filled with promises. He was offering her a job. A hard, unpaid, endless job. He was offering her more work. Nora looked away, her throat tight. She looked at his broad, capable back, at the quiet strength in his hands, and a cold fear, more real than any bullet, went through her. She had seen it before strong, capable women who tied their lives to strong, capable men, only to find their own light dimming until they were nothing but a shadow standing behind him.
"I won't be a man's shadow. Eli,"
she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"I can't. I'd sooner walk back to Dodge City."
He didn't seem surprised by her words. He seemed to understand them on a level that required no explanation. He watched her for a moment, then walked over to his saddlebags, which were slung over a nearby juniper. He rummaged inside and pulled out a folded, oilskin pouch. He walked back and held it out to her. She took it, her fingers fumbling with the ties. Inside was a worn, folded document. It was the deed to his land, his ranch, his home, everything he had, and on the bottom, beneath his own spidery, weathered signature, was a new entry. written in the clear, precise hand of Reverend Townsend. It was an addendum, legally witnessed and signed. It stated that the water rights and ownership of the spring known as Widow's Back were to be held in joint partnership. And there, next to his name, was hers Nora Vale. She stared at her own name on the paper, the ink still dark and new. He wasn't asking her to stand behind him. He was asking her to stand beside him. On paper, in the eyes of the law and the land itself. He had taken her greatest fear and answered it not with a promise, but with a fact. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the fading light. He just stood there, waiting, letting the document speak for him. She tried to nod. The motion began in her neck, a simple affirmation, but it faltered. She stopped, her head still, and did the only thing she knew how to do when the truth was uncertain. She took a slow breath, and she listened. She felt the frantic, bird-like flutter in her chest, the beat of fear, of uncertainty, of the pull of two different futures. It was the heartbeat of the woman who wanted the safety of Dodge City. But as she stood there on the solid earth, beside this solid man, feeling the cool evening breeze that smelled of life, the frantic rhythm began to slow. The flutter subsided, and in its place, a new beat emerged, steady, even, strong. It was the rhythm of home. Her body had answered before her lips could. With her free hand, she reached into her boot and drew out the dagger he had been holding for her. She offered it to him, handle first, just as he had offered his deed to her. "You should keep this for me," she said, her voice steady now. "I think I'm going to need your hands for other things more than I'll need this blade." He took the dagger, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt, small but definite, passed between them. He did not smile, but the harsh lines around his eyes softened. He slid the dagger back into his boot as if it belonged there. "Slowly," he said. It was his own kind of promise, not a promise of sudden passion or grand romance, but one of patience, of building something durable, day by day. A promise as tough and reliable as old leather. They started the next morning, with the help of the same 3 ranchers who had stood with him at the warehouse fire. They began to build the first windmill. It was a tower of hope, built from salvaged lumber and sheer determination. Nora, surprisingly agile, was the one who climbed the scaffolding, her engineer's eye ensuring every joint was true and every bolt was tight. Eli stood below, the anchorman, managing the ropes, his steady strength holding everything and everyone in place. The sun beat down on them, and they worked until their muscles screamed. Once, as she looked down from the rising tower, a drop of salty sweat fell from her brow and landed on his upturned, smiling face. That night, they were too tired for much talk. They sat on his porch, sharing a pan of cornbread and a jug of cool water from the spring. They ate in a silence that was comfortable, delicious, and from the hill, a new sound carried on the night wind. It was the gentle, rhythmic creak and whir of the new windmill, testing its blades, beginning to sing its quiet song of perseverance. On the far edge of town, another story was ending. A single wagon was being loaded in the dark outside the depot office. Cole Kincaid was leaving. He tossed his last bag into the back and climbed onto the driver's seat without a backward glance. As he picked up the reins, the lantern light caught his right hand. It was pale, and where his gold signet ring had been, there was now only a stark, white band of skin. The symbol of his power was gone, and the man underneath was a ghost. He slapped the reins, and the wagon rolled away into the darkness, leaving Dry Laurel to its new, hard-won peace. The hour before dawn was the quietest time, a moment held in the deep, velvet-lined pocket between night and day, on Widow's Back. The new windmill presided over this stillness, its metal blades turning with a slow, rhythmic grace in the high, cool air currents. It was a sound that had already woven itself into the fabric of Dry Laurel's life, a gentle, steady creak whir, a promise whispered on the wind. Below it, a constant, soothing gurgle of water spilled from a long pipe. flowing down a stone-lined channel and into a series of troughs that snaked their way down the hill toward the grateful town. The air was cool and damp, carrying a fine mist that settled on the collar of a man's shirt and clung to the stray hairs at a woman's temple. It was the feeling of life itself breathing in the dark. Eli and Nora stood near the base of the tower, their figures dark silhouettes against the first faint, pearlescent graying of the eastern sky. This was their new ritual, their morning watch. They came before the town awoke to check the pump, to inspect the lines, to ensure their hard-won miracle was still flowing. Nora turned to him in the quiet, the faint light softening the lines of her face. She reached out, just as she had in the church, and took his hand. It was an action that was becoming familiar now, comfortable. She placed his large, rough palm flat against her chest, over her heart. The warmth of her skin met the calloused coolness of his. "Can you hear it?" she asked, her voice a low murmur, a part of the pre-dawn quiet. "It's steady. I'm staying." He closed his eyes for a moment, listening with his hand. He felt the strong, even rhythm, the unwavering beat of her life, of her truth. It was the same steady beat that had anchored him in the chaos of the fire, the same truth that had dismantled a tyrant in the church. It was the sound of her. He opened his eyes and gave a slow, deep nod. He understood. Then, with a deliberation that was entirely his own, he did something he had never done before. He released his hand from her chest, but instead of letting it drop, he gently took her bandaged hand in his. He lifted it and placed it against his own chest. Beneath her palm, she felt the slow, solid, thudding rhythm of his heart. It was not a frantic or a hurried beat. It was deep and powerful, a slow and patient engine that had weathered years of hardship and solitude. It felt like the land itself, like a fence post set deep in the earth, unmovable, unbreakable. It was the heartbeat of a man who did not waste a single motion, or a single word, or a single beat of his own heart. It was the sound of his endurance. "You'll learn my body by dawn," Nora said, her voice soft, her gaze locked with his. She was repeating her mysterious promise from that first night on the saloon porch, but now its meaning was as clear as the water at their feet. "And I'll learn yours." It was not a promise of a single night of passion, but a vow for a lifetime of mornings. To learn the language of his tired shoulders after a long day. For him to learn the meaning of the small, thoughtful frown that creased her brow when she was solving a problem. To learn the map of each other's scars, the rhythm of each other's labor, the steady, unspoken truth of each other's presence. They turned to their work, their bodies moving with an easy, practiced synchronicity. It was a slow dance performed without music. He checked the tension on the guy wires that held the tower steady against the wind, his hands knowing just the right amount of give. She inspected the leather gaskets on the pump rod, her fingers, though still tender, gentle and sure. He tightened a loose bolt on the main axle, the screech of the wrench a sharp, discordant note in the morning's quiet symphony. She cleared a small obstruction of tumbleweed from the mouth of the main trough. They moved around each other in the small space, anticipating each other's needs, a silent conversation passing between them with every shared tool, every knowing glance. From down the hill, carried on the cool morning air, a new sound arose. It was the sound of children's laughter, high and clear, followed by a joyous splash. The children of Dry Laurel had discovered that the last trough in the line, the one nearest the town, was a wonderful place to play in the early morning before their chores began. The sound broke the spell of their quiet work. Nora stopped, a wrench in her hand, and a genuine, unburdened smile spread across her face. It was the sound of their success, the sound of a town no longer thirsty. She looked at Eli and saw that he was listening too, a stillness in his posture. She reached out and, with a gesture of simple, unthinking intimacy, brushed a smudge of axle grease from his shirt. He looked down at her hand, then back to her face. He didn't smile, He simply gave that slow, deliberate nod that was his signature. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of understanding, of a shared satisfaction that ran too deep for words. And in that moment, with the windmill turning softly above them and the sound of laughing children below, he leaned down. He closed the small space between them and kissed her. It was not a long or dramatic kiss. It was short, and it was real. It tasted of the cool morning air, of the faint, metallic tang of the well water on his lips. It was salty with the sweat of their shared labor and held the faint, clean scent of the linseed oil he used to treat the wood. There were no soaring emotions, no grand declarations. It was a kiss that belonged to the earth, to the work, to the quiet truth of what they had built together. There were no witnesses, save for the rising sun. There were no vows, save for the ones their bodies had already made to one another. When they parted, the world had changed. The sun had finally crested the dark line of the mountains, and a wave of brilliant, brass-colored light washed over the land. It lit the turning blades of the windmill, making them gleam. It gilded the backs of the cattle drinking peacefully at the troughs. It fell upon Eli's broad back and his dark, patched shirt. And for the first time, Nora thought it looked not like the color of solitude, but like the color of good, rich earth. The windmill continued its soft, rhythmic song. The water continued its steady, life-giving murmur. They had learned each other not through whispered words in the dark, but through the calloused language of their hands, through the shared weight of a shovel, through the steady, trusting beat of their hearts in the clear light of day. Dry laurel was no longer dry, and hope, they were discovering, was not a loud, boisterous thing. It was quiet. It was steady. It was simply the work of choosing to stand together every single morning. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by many more.